there. Ooh. How much?
Exactly. In which room?
In which room?
Well, thank you. Everybody online, you didn't miss anything. That was just the introduction of me. So that was nothing important. So we can skip right over that. So I want to acknowledge that I am not an expert on wine. I am not a sommelier. I am not a wine grower myself. I am a social historian. So I come at this from a particular angle or set of angles. And there are lots of other angles in this room and online. So I really want this to be a conversation because I am greedy for all the bits and pieces and perspectives that everybody here can share. And I would, humbly request that you give me as much information as the tidbits that I am going to give you, that this is really meant to open a conversation because there are lots of pieces of these puzzles that I don't know and that we are all still learning. So I just want to put that out there and open this up into a conversational style as much as possible. So if you have something to add, or if I get something wrong from where you sit, please jump in and let me know, and we can go tangentially and then circle back to other things. So just to lay the foundations for that, what comes to mind when people think about wine in the Middle East? And let me know if anybody jumps in online with a comment in the chat or whatever.
Well, personal experiences.
Yeah. So give us a very expurgated version of that. When
as an invitee in Saudi Arabia in 2007, before some big changes that have happened since, I was walked through the National Museum, and off in a corner was a piece of a fresco from one of the Hellenistic sites in Saudi Arabia. And there was an image of the god Bacchus. And, they knew it was a god Bacchus because he was very drunk and he was holding grapes. And so that image of, sort of wine and inebriation on display in the National Museum in Saudi Arabia, and the sort of commentary and buzz among the male guides who were taking us around was.
Oh, that is fascinating. Great vignette. Thank you. Anybody else? Yeah.
Well, mine's Greco-Roman too. As a medievalist, I instantly kind of go to the whole amphorae trade and the shipwrecks and the sort of the idea of how the movement and storage and trade in wine.
Oh, I love that. In fact, I have a very good friend who's an Armenian adventurer, and he used to dive and take people to shipwrecks with all of these amphora and talk about it. And he got so interested in that wine culture, he ended up working for a big winemaking and liquor distribution company, which was great because every time I went to visit him, we had very, very good wines from Turkey. So interesting. Anybody else? Wine in the Middle East.
I think of Shiraz.
Yep. Think of Shiraz. Very, very famous wines.
I'd say from the wine growing perspective, my assumption, and I don't drink much Middle Eastern wine, but my assumption is that it's super dry. But if there are historically large vineyards, then those plants must be properly stressed in order to really produce good quality grapes.
Yep. Great. So that's a perspective that, in terms of wine making, I don't know what exactly makes what kinds of wines where, but what I do know is travelers' accounts of what kinds of wines that were best known and best loved from different places in the region. And so you had a lot of trade because some people, of course, preferred certain wines over others. So that's always interesting. Wine is such a local good that it's always worth investing in the trade in wine so that you can get something that tastes like wines from there. So big economic as well as climate, environmental, agriculture issue. Anything from online folks? Interesting that nobody mentioned wine and Islam. I mean, tangentially, of course. I remember hearing somebody smuggled in a bottle of champagne and a great big box of tampons once into
use
Saudi
that.
Arabia because they wanted to surprise someone who was working in Saudi Arabia. And so there were all of these ways that people tried to get around them. Although apparently the best way used to be working for an embassy because you could just get bottles of wine or other intoxicants into the country quite easily that way. And then people had, of course, stills and other equipment in their own homes. So I always remind myself that when something is forbidden, especially when it is forbidden over and over and over, that's because people are doing that thing. You don't have to forbid something that nobody is doing. So we'll come back to that. Yeah.
Well, I would just add on the flip side of that, wine is central to Jewish ritual across the Middle East.
Absolutely. And to Christian ritual across the region. So, and in some ways, the prohibition of wine in Islam is central to Islamic identity, in contradistinction to those religious traditions as well. So you had ISIS, for example, attacking vineyards and burning them when in Syria, for example. So, yeah.
No, there's at least one story in 1001 Nights where male characters are drinking, but also drinking in the presence of a woman.
Mhm.
And it's meant to be like this scandalous episode within the story.
Right. Except that, of course, in 1001 Nights, many of the stories are transgressive, but they're also illustrative of the social conventions of the time. And if you were elite in that period, you typically drank wine. And if you didn't, you were known as kind of a very pious stick in the mud, if you're from the camp that appreciates wine drinking, or pious holy person if you were not. And so there's always been those two strands in elite cultures of the Middle East. I would say until the 20th century when that conversation changes to a certain extent in the modern period. All right, well, let's get started and think a little bit about this. We are going to think about a couple of different.
It's not flipping.
Oh, it stopped flipping because you still have the.
Oh,
Sorry.
did you grab it?
I did. Haha, there we go. All right. So let me just get rid of this so we don't have to look at that. All right, so actually one fell off the bottom here. We'll talk about religion and ritual, as we just talked about, the social and symbolic drinking and production of wine. Wine as medicine, of course. I won't talk a lot about that, but anybody who's familiar with the Hellenistic traditions or others knows that wine is very often seen as a really important medicinal ingredient in which other things are dissolved, or itself as something quite important. We can talk about the trade, some more artistic depictions of wine drinking, which again is a kind of social capital, and then climate and environment, which I knocked off the bottom of my slide. So, wrong one. So this is, I'm not sure if it is still the oldest known winery. It seems like every few months, a new older winery comes to light in the region. Somewhere between Armenia, Georgia, and Phoenicia, the Taurus Mountains in Turkey, the Zagros Mountains in Iran. There are many, many ancient sites where you see wine presses and fermentation vats. And this one is 6,100 years old or thereabouts. So winemaking has been happening on a large scale in the region for a very, very long time. And of course, there are wild grapes throughout the region, but when you get to this kind of level of production, you're certainly talking about domestication of grapes that have higher yields, and so you need a more proto-industrial type of setup in order to produce this amount of wine. So it's really interesting to see the various ways in which we can contextualize these sites. This one is seems to be a very ritually important site where there's graves and it seems to be part of religious ritual, and others seem to be much more commercial in nature. So, oh, thank you. I keep doing that. So here, for example, this is a reconstruction of a Phoenician winery where it was seems to have been for commercial production and trade to various other states and entities around the Mediterranean. Phoenician wines were known to be very good and sought after, so they commanded a pretty high price.
It's like a workout. They're like really.
Exactly, and I love that, you know, some of them only get one to hang on to, that the lucky guy has two, but you can imagine at the end of a long, you know, day of pressing those grapes that you're, you know, hanging off your subway straps there to support yourself so you don't, of course, you don't want to fall into the vat. But it is, it's a labor intensive process, right, to do this. You can see similar things with, in ancient Egypt. Same thing, Barbara, go here. Again, the harvesting, the crushing, it looks almost exactly the same as the Phoenician setup. And they're put into these clay amphora for fermentation and transport. So there's the transport is almost an essential part of putting them into transportable amphora for the fermentation and then the transport, whereas where you would have the original one in Armenia, it looks like much of the wine was consumed ritually in that area for the purposes of the pilgrims that were coming. So it's really interesting to see that interplay between local consumption of a particular religious community in a particular place versus the larger trade dynamics. And you see that playing out over and over, even today, where you have local winemakers who are making wine that is preferred by or that is produced in a way that is ritually appropriate for particular communities. And so that stays often in a lineage within a particular community. I forgot what else was I going to talk about in terms of ancient production? You know, I'm sure that there's a lot more around the Mediterranean, but depending on what happens over time in terms of climate, you see that some areas get overstressed and can no longer produce high quality wine. And so production areas shift from centuries to centuries to other areas, either because of political changes. So the coming of Islam meant it was impossible to continue to make wine in certain areas. In other places, for example, you could look at Egypt later, much later, and see that the annual inundation of the Nile is important for the production of grapes. And when you no longer have that, Egypt cannot sustain production of grapes. In the very early period, it seems that Egypt did not grow a lot of grapes, but imported the grape juice, and then had to import vines from Lebanon in order to begin a modern rebuilding of the wine industry for, of course, or by predominantly the Christian Coptic community. For those of you who are historians, are there thoughts that you have on how these winemaking traditions changed over time? Or, I mean, I know environmentally, you may have thoughts about where the best wines would have come from. There are certainly some places that at least argue or advertise that they have very ancient vines and varieties. Boğaz Kere in Turkey, go.osu, which is the two bull's eyes wine grape that is from the Caucasus, I believe, and now in northwest Turkey, northeast Turkey, a very prized grape. So there are a lot of ancient varieties, but there's also a lot that's been brought in from Europe over the last century and a half, 2 centuries now. Boy, that happened fast. That whole 20th century to mid 21st century thing just zipped right by me.
So the
Any-
one that comes to mind is Britain, but that's not the Middle East, where in the Roman period,
Yeah.
they were growing grapes and producing wine in Britain. And then so famously, it was the Roman warm period. And when that climate shift happened, they stopped being able to produce wine. And they're now starting to plant vineyards in the UK again with climate warming. But I don't know the Middle Eastern ones.
Yeah, I only hear that this region used to be, I mean, you'll get one traveler's account. This region used to be famous for the production of wine, and now it doesn't produce those anymore. Or you get, stories of eating grapes that are very famous in one city, but then there's no record of it later on. So it's very interesting to see what kind of varieties and what kinds of wines are produced in different areas. There's also the whole Shiraz, Syrah confusion where, Shiraz was very famous for mostly white, sweeter wines, I think, whereas Syrah, the Australian, et cetera, variety is not that. So, but in general, I think there's a lot of, there are ancient varieties that people are really
You got a
interested in
thumbs up.
starting to regrow across the region, and not just grow the European varieties in the area as a way of trying to both re-energize the winemaking traditions in the region, but also to try and find grape varieties that are actually more suited to the soils and ecology of the region. Although, of course, that ecology is changing, right? With climate change, I think it's going to make an enormous difference in the areas that are able to produce what kinds of wine. I already hear from people in Turkey that it's getting harder and harder to produce wines the way that they had, or the same wines that they had, because of climate change. And also, of course, because rivers are being moved and water is being reallocated, which makes a difference as well. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Oh, it's less about the wine itself and more about the production. Like, I'm interested both in these images of ancient Egypt and ancient Phoenicia, and I'm just curious about like the caste system and the relations. So I'm noticing particularly in the slide about ancient Phoenicia, the people who are pressing the wine are dressed differently from the people who are kind of putting on. And I was curious if this was a lot of like enslaved labor, or was it certain castes who did the wine pressing, and what was the sort of structure of exchange between the production and the consumption?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm not an Egyptologist, so I hesitate to speak
We
too
have
much
one.
about exactly what that looks like. But I'm sure, just like today, there's the owners and the experts who get to decide what gets produced, how and when harvest happens and all of that. And there are the kind of overseers, and then there are the flunkies with their bare feet in the in the wine press.
Yeah, absolutely. The structure would not be vastly different from what we see with any industry, where you have the the workers who are actually harvesting the grapes, who are pressing the grapes, who are fermenting, but then it would go to the proper winemakers and then of course the merchants.
So if it's an area where enslaved people were used as labor, inexpert manual labor, then they would certainly be used in that capacity. But in other places, for example, in Turkey, I'm quite certain that there were, I'm certain there were even Muslims who owned vineyards where they had Christians overseeing the production of wine as the experts, because very often the Ottomans would use enslaved Christians to be those experts because they had the traditions, right? In general, it was in fact the Christians and Jewish families who were the winemakers during Ottoman times and in other Muslim dominant societies, because that then provided cover for, you know, the state is not producing wine or Muslims are not engaging in this. So the trade and the production of wine was also forbidden to Muslims, right? So it was not just that the drinking of wine was haram, but also the production and sale of wine. So again, that doesn't mean people didn't do it. It just means that that was considered to be part of the prohibition. Yeah.
Muslim governments still tax the sale of wine though.
Oh, yeah. They're not going to give up all that money, which is, of course, in some ways why it wasn't totally forbidden, both because the elites still wanted access to the wine and because it was a source of revenue, right? All right, so let's talk a little bit about trade in wine. As we know, there are lots of shipwrecks that give us these beautiful amphora showing us that wine was one of the most important exports across and within the region and certainly outside it as well. And so you can see this is a Byzantine era winemaking infrastructure was the word I wanted, now in Israel, and this was absolutely enormous. They had huge vats. It produced, you know, thousands of gallons of wine, and these were sold as a kind of high-priced export around the region, really known for how popular these particular wines were. So it was, if you were in a place that had high quality wine production, it was something that you would tax whether you were a Muslim leader or not, and that would give you a certain amount, not just the revenue, but cachet, right? Because wine, excellent wine, has always been something that people felt very proud of and that kind of defined a region, even if you weren't necessarily a drinker of the wine. It was still something that set a place apart. In the Islamic period, we have tons and tons of travelogues where they go to a city and they list all of the exports of that city and the things that it's best known for, the kinds of watermelons and the eating grapes and the raisins and the wines and all of these other things that make that feel like something that is part of the identity of a city or a region. And that was a really important thing to people, to have their home region acknowledged. All right, so again, I'm not an expert on Jewish traditions and wine, especially in terms of the wine making and distribution, other than the broader trading networks. But the identity of Jewish communities around wine and the sanctity and ritual about having to do with wine, I think are really important. There's wine is required for many rituals, and on the Sabbath with the marriage ceremony, with at certain celebrations, Purim, having a cup of wine as part of these religious rituals and celebrations is a reminder that in this moment we have plenty, right? That there is bounty and fullness and most importantly, joy. I think that there's a sense in which wine represents this joyousness of celebration and community, regardless of other hardships that might be going on beyond the particular day, celebration, community, that moment. In the moment, wine has all of these resonances that are really, I think, interesting and particular to the Jewish tradition. The consumption of wine feels very different in each of these traditions, in each of these religious traditions. But the ritual consumption of wine is really important. And there is a social consumption of wine as well. In Jewish neighborhoods, the owners of taverns would typically be Jewish. And I know the Ottoman case best, but in other places where they had a cosmopolitan population, you would have it in particular neighborhoods, the equivalent of taverns or meyhanes or whatever they were called would be run by members of that community, so that it became part of the social fabric, not always seen as the best example of that community, right? So you had, there was a kind of, depending on the neighborhood and the socioeconomic quality of the neighborhood, they could be kind of a high-end establishment, like this looks like. Everybody is dressed very nicely, and there's a sense of, we're coming out to enjoy ourselves, like a nice night out, but there's also rather seedier establishments, right? So you get this sense of that taverns functioned at both ends of the, or all, the very highest end, we'll talk about it in a minute, and then at the, kind of middle and lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum as well.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, what would happen in Jewish neighborhoods where I'm thinking specifically of Yemen, which had a very visible Jewish community in a number of cities. And I spent some time in the Jewish court, the Ga in Sana'a. What would the Jewish community have done in a place where wine was really proscribed?
In general,
Is that
and I'm
known?
trying to think of an example from Yemen. I'm trying to think if, I don't think there's anything in Evliad Chalabi. I'd have to do some looking, but in general, in Islamic law, wine is permitted for Jews and Christians, right? So it's an element of having these dhimmi communities that they are allowed to practice their law and ritual. And generally speaking, that means that they can make and consume wine.
So Umayyad, Spain, North Africa.
Absolutely.
Medieval, right?
Absolutely. On the other hand, when you get an extreme movement coming in, then you often have attacks on those places, and because they represent something that is haram. So, the legal tradition says one thing, the politics of the moment may say something else, right? So there's a historical specificity that I'm not on top of in terms of what it looked like in Yemen at any particular period. But you can look at Damascus, you can look at Istanbul, you can look at Baghdad or other places and see moments when you have an ultra conservative or ultra orthodox group taking power, and they will shut down taverns or persecute people who are known to be drunkards. And over time, that enthusiasm typically wanes, and it goes back to the kind of norm. In the Ottoman Empire, it was really notable that Suleiman, the magnificent lawgiver, it was was tolerated these taverns and wine drinking amongst the elites perfectly fine until he got older and saw the end coming and became much more ascetic himself, and much more observant, and then enforced that observance upon the society and closed all of the taverns. So, and of course it was not just Christians and Jews who were going to the taverns. I mean, we know that. And it was also, lots of elites were drinking wine as well. So, yeah, the imposition affected everybody equally, and there was equal resentment by all parties, including the tax collectors.
You may not know what this image, I'm just curious, the ancient Egypt one you had was clearly red wine. This one is clearly white wine, or is that a reference, just over time the coloration's changed? I'm assuming that in the Middle East there's a lot of red wine production just because of the heat and the environment. Is there anything in terms that in terms of preference toward one or the other, or maybe just in this picture there's white wine?
Yeah, no, this is a picture from Purim celebration, and I don't know what the particulars of wine production in that area, or if it was, could certainly be imported from elsewhere. I know that there are references to white wines, but many of them are places that are more mountainous, and I don't know if that makes it more possible, but yeah, I mean, a lot of times the poetry talks about wine as being red. So that's certainly, I think, the dominant sense, and so white wine would be more of an exception. But I'm not sure, and I'm not sure whether in Jewish communities there was a different preference either. Yeah.
Well, I don't know about this particular example, but when you were talking about sort of particular grapes and the Shiraz issue, and I kept thinking about it, and it's not really Middle Eastern as much as Roman-wide is the Falernian wine that was the prized wine of the Roman elite, and it was white, but it was from Italian grapes. But it spread throughout, it was like a prize and got shipped everywhere.
Interesting.
And it survives into poetry well into the Middle Ages as like the epitome of fancy wine.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I think the smaller climate changes over, decades, et cetera, and the fact that the topography of the region is so different depending on whether you're between the mountains and the sea, or you're on the other side of the mountains where it's much drier, or the mountains are very high, so you have very kind of more temperate areas on the mountain slopes, which you don't have in certain other places. It just makes a big, I expect that there's the potential for white wine as well as red, and I just don't know what areas were known for white wine production, if any, over time. But that's really interesting. That is much more up your alley than mine. Okay, so any other thoughts that people have or interest in the Jewish traditions?
Sorry, it's less about the Jewish tradition, but you were mentioning the taverns a lot. Do we have any accounts? Because in a lot of Mesopotamian texts, tavern owners are female. So do we have a gendered aspect to that in the Jewish tradition, or do we not really have accounts for that? And then subsequently, when you also mentioned how you have the more reputable establishments versus the less than reputable establishments. I know in the law code of Hammurabi, they mention a tavern keeper who, if she's essentially cheating people on the drink, the repercussions that she will have. And so I was wondering if we see that in other tavern kind of elements in other traditions.
Certainly, I remember looking at 19th century Istanbul taverns where it was often a tavern keeper and his wife. I mean, it's always talked about in that way. Sometimes the widow who is running the tavern. So there is the possibility, and of course, women can inherit. So if a woman had that property, then she could certainly be running it. But it certainly was not the more common. Most common was, of course, that men owned it and profited off of it. But yeah, and I'm interested in the social history of the agricultural piece, because I don't know when between the wine production and the decisions about what grapes in what proportions and what was to be grown and what was being successfully grown, how gender had or didn't have an impact, is really interesting, because I would love to know more about how large the wineries were and whether they were all family owned or whether some were large estates that were owned by governors or sub-governors or sanjaks or whatever it is, because it's really interesting to see how much of a different scale might make. Usually when the bigger the scale, the less influence women have in the production, and I would be curious to see if that's true here too. So it's a good question. Have no idea. Okay, how are we doing on time? 45 minutes, oops. That's going the wrong way. Okay, so let's go then to Christianity. Again, huge symbolism around wine in Christian traditions. I think it's as in Judaism, wine represents a kind of the fullness of the cup, right? That's the image, is that there's bounty in wine. But there's also this, the I am the vine verse is all about, I'm the vine. God is the one who takes care, who tends the vine and cuts off the branches that are no good and prunes the ones that are good so they become more productive. So this symbolism of the vine, and then of course the Eucharist in the Roman Catholic and certain Orthodox traditions, where traditionally the transubstantiation of grapes and bread into the body and blood of Christ, and then the consumption of those, the Eucharist, is utterly fundamental, right? So it's fascinating to see that those substances of those agricultural fundamentals of the vine and wheat become integrated as the fundamental part of the religion, right? That is the thing that people need the most from God, are the food and the bread and the wine. And so that becomes literally what you take in community, from God, and metaphorically, of course, in the wider world. So to me, I think that's really interesting, in that the metaphor of society being a vine, and you cannot be productive unless you are being you are committed to God, and God is allowing you to be productive by pruning, which again, depending on who you listen to, is another metaphor for the trials and troubles of life, that makes you more productive as well. in at least a religious sense. So it's really fascinating to see how that imagery in the Bible becomes integrated into the traditions of, in this case, Roman Catholics with Eucharist, but also in other traditions as well. So the wording, it was really interesting. Went down a rabbit hole looking at different translations of the, drink from this, all of you, for this is my blood, which is being poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. And there are so many different translations of that depending upon the church and the denomination, stressing one part or another of this verse. But again, the idea that this pouring of the wine is about the forgiveness of sin. And the pouring out of the blood is forgiveness of sin. And so in this sense, there's a lot less joy, right? This is about the gratitude and grief and repentance for sin, so that the gift of Jesus is not left to wither. And then you have other elements, other Christian traditions, where the symbolism of the wine is still there, but it's much more connected to agricultural rhythms and to community practice and to celebration. So this is one. I love the Armenian blessing of the grapes, which happens at the feast of the Assumption of the Holy Mary. So this again becomes a harvest rite. But what's really interesting is that this is about blessing the grapes, so celebrating bounty, but it is also, as many fast days in the Armenian calendar, and I think the Armenians have more fast days than anybody else. I think they win the fasting prize, and they have different fasts for that restrict different things. So it's not just no red meat or whatever, but you cannot eat fresh grapes before the blessing of the grapes. The reason being that they wanted to make sure that they had a harvest of the grapes to make the ritual wine before the harvest could be consumed in other ways, right? So you needed to make the ritual wine with blessed grapes. And it became both a prohibition about eating fresh grapes ahead of that time, and also a way of blessing the entire harvest and the celebration of the labor and the bounty, resultant bounty of the community. So I love this. I was just gonna read the actual one of the prayers that was written. About or during this festival. Bless, O Lord, the grape plants and vineyards from which these grapes are taken and presented to the Holy Church, and make them bountiful and fruitful. Let them be like good and fertile land. Protect the vineyards from all kinds of misfortune and destruction, which come from above because of our sins, from hail, from cold, from hot winds, and from destructive insects, so that we may enjoy that which you have created in this world for our enjoyment and for your glory. And grant that we may be worthy to eat and drink with you from the bounty of your most fruitful vine at the table of your Father's kingdom. So here you have a connection between the disasters that every farmer faces and sin, and also wine for ritual purpose and for enjoyment, all combined in one prayer. Yeah.
Is there any meta thought about if the climate is so bad or there's so many pests that there is, in essence, more sin, or if we're just less sinful, the climate should be great for is there that kind of connection?
I haven't heard it in relation to climate change, But that's really interesting. It'd be really interesting to talk to some Armenian theologians and sort of see, you know, did they bring this up? Do they have these discussions, or is this, you know, simply a metaphor, or does it become apocalyptic, right? That if you know, climate change is this bad, then we're seeing a divine response to all of the other turbulence that's happening in the world. Yeah, interesting point. I haven't seen it, but I would love to see, to think about that. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about Islam then. Again, there's two things to think about: wine for Muslims and wine for non-Muslims under Muslim rule. And again, we've often forgotten that winemaking and wine drinking went on as a perfectly legal enterprise for Christians and Jews living under Muslim rule. That's codified, right? So except for those exceptions of hyper zealous, usually new incursions of certain rulers, Islam allows wine for non-Muslims. But it is also not uncommon for Muslims, of course, the consumption of wine, and this is khamr, so there's another rabbit hole to be gone down about what khamr actually is. In the Quran, it seems to refer to fermented grape wine, but there are some who are like non-fermented grapes with must, which might have a low alcohol content, also forbidden. Or any kind of intoxicant, from pot to opium to you know, anything that you can become addicted to is also forbidden. So why is it so confusing about what wine in the Muslim tradition is? Why do you not drink wine?
That's what the prohibition on alcohol flows from, right? Like that, the mention of khamr.
Yes, and it's mentioned several times in both the Quran and in the stories of the Prophet, right? So you get, of course, a variety of different things that you can interpret, and people like to cherry pick which interpretation they're going to focus on, right? So, I mean, one of the Quranic verses is believers, intoxicants, and gambling, and idols, and drawing lots, which is also gambling, right? Are all evil of Satan's handiwork. So shun them so you can be successful.
Mhm.
So that does not say they are forbidden to you.
That's true.
It does not say they are haram. It does not say do not do these things. It says shun them so you can be successful, i.e., if you want to be successful, don't do these things.
It's saying you shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
Read the verse of Quran here for me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it says that يسألونك عن الخمر والميسر قل فيهما اسم كبير ومنافع للناس واسمها أكبر من نفعها ويسألونك ماذا ينفقون قل كذلك يبين الله لكم الآيات لعلكم تتفكرون. So as you
Yeah,
said, like
this is
the
a different-
translation, yeah.
Different piece, but again, do you want to translate that?
Yeah, I can do that. So they say that what about the wine and also gambling? So tell them about they're both like they're great sins if you do it, but they have some benefits if you do it as well. And both of them, the sin is more than the benefit. That's why you shouldn't do that.
You should avoid them.
Yeah, and yeah, that was it.
So does that sound like a total prohibition? No.
No.
Right? So I mean, and many people read into that. For medicinal purposes, it's okay. If you drink in moderation, it's okay. If you gamble in moderation, I don't know what that looks like, but you know, that's okay. So it's not great, right? It's not a good thing, but it does have some benefits, but the harms are worse than the benefits. So it's like a conversation where somebody is saying, yeah, But, and, you know, well, and I guess, and it keeps making it a little bit worse. And then there are hadith where it's absolutely forbidden, and then there are others where it's, you know, it's forbidden because somebody came in drunk to prayer, and then you can't pray properly if you're drunk. So you should never do something that doesn't allow you to pray. So there's this kind of back and forth about how forbidden is forbidden, how haram is it, or is it just inadvisable, right? And why? And when is it allowed, and for whom? And so you get into a lot of hair splitting on the one hand, and then you get into some who are just like, anything, anywhere, anytime should be forbidden, and we shouldn't allow other people to do it because they'll be a bad influence on the Muslims, and just nothing. So there's obviously space for interpretation here. I remember I was on a panel right after 9/11 when we were doing a lot of work to talk about Islam and be descriptive rather than prescriptive. And I was on a panel with an imam from Turkey. And so we were chatting before the program, and you know, I was talking about, you know, it's people think that because there are these 5 pillars of Islam, et cetera, that all Muslims are perfect Muslims because we only look at the doctrine and assume everybody does it. And I said, like, for example, alcohol, you know, Turkey produces an enormous amount of rakı, for example. And if only the Christians in Turkey were drinking that rakı, then they would, that small percentage would all be dead of alcohol poisoning within a week. It's just not possible. Obviously, Muslims drink. Not all Muslims drink, but many Muslims drink. And he said, well, if they're Muslims, if they drink, they're not Muslims. And if they're Muslims, they don't drink. And I'm like, well, that's the difference between our perspectives. I'm actually describing what people do, what we can see. And you're describing what you believe people ought to do. And those are really different things, right? So I am in no position as a non-Muslim to get into a theological debate with a Muslim about whether wine should or should not be permissible, right? But as a historian, I can tell you that Muslims drink. Some Muslims drink, and some Muslims have always drunk, and some Muslims have always avoided alcohol. And so that is the historical reality. So trying to navigate that can be controversial, but it's also just historically true. We have records to show this. Yeah.
Well, that's totally in my wheelhouse because I studied medieval religion and sort of like what is proscribed culturally versus what is popularly believed in saints' cults. But this totally reminds me of some recent podcasts I've been listening to about modern day Mormon culture and what is discussions within the community of what is Mormon and what is Mormon behavior and what does it mean that some Mormons drink, but some other people think that no Mormons should drink, and if you don't drink, it's kind of interesting, like the universality of those religious discussions about how does behavior map onto identity.
Right, exactly, and theology. And you can be, you know, who you have the identity of being a member of this culture and this religion, and there's no question that that is who you are and who your people are. And yet there's this doctrinal view that, you know, we do not do that thing, right? Both internally and externally because of the stereotypes that people have. So I just find it really, really interesting because, you know, you also see it with coffee later on, right? You see it with, you know, this over and over and over again. My husband used to work with the Christian Science Monitor, and the Christian scientists, they had Coke machines in the monitor that only had caffeine-free Coke. and there was only decaf coffee. But everybody would go across the street to the Starbucks and or McDonald's or whatever, and come back with, you know, carrier cups that were not obviously one or the other. And you know, when someone was caught with an actual Coke can, he was like, my face slipped. You know, so it's just this, you know, what people enjoy, what people believe is too onerous, becomes a kind of semi-accepted norm in some circles within the religion, right? Okay, so next. So elites have, of course, a different set of rules, have always had a different set of rules. And so you have this very widespread elite culture across the Middle East where wine drinking was perfectly normal amongst the upper class, and many of their social activities, hunting and picnicking and feasts, were all accompanied with wine. Moreover, there was this whole tradition of wine poetry where, okay, I'll just say conveniently for some, there is a resonance between the drunkenness of that you get from wine or other intoxicants and what Sufis saw as the ecstatic experience of being one with God. So that metaphor of drunkenness was used extensively in poetry of the Islamic period to both as secular poetry about drinking wine and as divine poetry about attempting to reach God. And sometimes it's really unclear which it is. And there are all kinds of metaphors that occur again and again and again in this poetry. The beautiful young male wine bearer who pours the cups of wine. Sometimes this is really a cute young man who is pouring the wine at a feast, and the people at the feast are admiring him. And sometimes this is a symbol of divine beauty and the divine desire to bring people into that state of divine intoxication, right? And again, the cup, the wine, everything has a symbolic meaning within this Sufi religious poetry. And then there is also a secular equivalent. And very often we, or I shouldn't say very often, but we have historical examples of people who are taken to task for their lascivious poetry who say, no, you're missing the point. This is all about approaching the divine, right? The unrequited lover is all about being unable to reach that union with God. And so all of this poetry about how beautiful my beloved is really about how beautiful the divine is, right? So sometimes and sometimes not, right? And it can be very difficult to pick those apart. But it wouldn't have made sense to have divine poetry, Sufi poetry that talked about drunkenness and talked about love and talked about sex and talked about lust and talked about yearning if those things weren't present as metaphors, as real examples in society for poets to draw upon, right? It was very clearly lived experience, not something imagined. And again, in the same way that you have that you don't forbid things that nobody's doing, similarly here, you can't equate a divine process as a metaphor if nobody knows what that is, right? So it has to resonate. Let me go. Oh, wrong way. Clearly my mouse at home is set up the wrong way. Just one more thing and then we can open it up. This is Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who is very famously the wife of an ambassador to the Sublime Porte in the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century. And one of the guests that she had, or one of the places that she was a guest, she discovered that this guy was drinking wine just as much as the Europeans at the feast, and she asks him, how can you do that? And I think his answer is really interesting. All creatures of God are good, and everything is designed for the use of man. The prohibition of wine is really smart for those people of the lower classes who cannot control themselves. But we elites who are educated, the prophet was never meaning to keep us from drinking wine, because we know how to drink in moderation, right? We know how not to go too far. And if you don't go too far, it's not forbidden, right? So he also said that you should avoid scandal. And so we don't do it publicly, we do it privately with the other rich people. And that's okay, right? So there's this very clear class distinction about who is allowed to have wine and who isn't. Because we educated rich people can enjoy wine in moderation, which in fact they did not always. So just understanding that there is this very clear sense that the elite is above those things and not subject to those kinds of religious prohibitions, and that there's no shame in drinking wine amongst these elite classes until you get some incursion from outside, or like Suleiman, an older monarch who suddenly becomes more conservative as he gets older, and then it becomes not cool to drink with other, so it becomes a much more private thing, right? Did not stop, I'm sure.
Curious, I mean, I'm curious about like the Saudi prohibition. Do you think that was like an identity thing? Like like it's sort of, let's set us apart from other countries, other cultures, and really like do this thing? Or if it's
I mean, I think it's also because the modern Saudi state was created as an alliance between the House of Saud and the Wahhabis, right?
Yes.
So, and the Wahhabi sect is very hyper-Orthodox, right?
Yes.
So that meant that for a very long time, until these very recent reforms instituted by Mohammed bin Salman, that there was an overweening influence of the Wahhabist clergy over the moral fiber of the state. So they were granted control over education and social behavior in a pretty clear division of spheres of influence, so that the House of Saud got to rule, got to use the oil wealth and distribute it, got to make the political decisions, but that control over morality was given to the Wahhabi clergy. Right now, their hold on that has been broken. But even during that time, the consumption of alcohol was absolutely everywhere in the elite class.
I was gonna say,
Absolutely everywhere.
maybe their culture was quite different at that time.
I mean,
know.
public culture was, there were very clearly, these are men's spaces and these are women and family spaces. There was no public drinking at all. It wasn't mentioned in public. And if people got caught with alcohol, it was a serious offense. But still, many households had a way to bring in alcohol. You could easily buy it on the black market. There were the diplomatic pouches, which crates. So there was, even then, in such a very clear prohibited environment, there was still consumption, right? So one of the things that I'm not an expert in, but I find a really interesting question, is that in these periods where wine is supposedly prohibited to some extent or another, and yet we know people are drinking, what is the mechanism? What is the mechanism of trade where that much wine is imported for consumption by people who ostensibly are not supposed to be drinking wine? Right? How does that happen? And how is the trade part allowed, right? Is it all wine by and for Christians? Is it, which doesn't help in the Saudi case because there aren't any, right? So it's very interesting to see how those economic arrangements are made for the movement of these goods that are ostensibly prohibited.
And what's the role of like the schools of thought? Because it seems like in general, it seems like if you come from a school of thought in Islam that's more relaxed, then that country will also be more relaxed about alcohol.
Yeah, I mean, I've always had my doubts about the actual influence of schools of law.
Okay.
And it does make some difference. And I think the Hanbalis, I always get it wrong, but I think the Hanbalis are the ones who said Khamr is wine from fermented grapes, and that is all it is,
Right.
right?
I bet it is. Yeah, I bet
And
it is,
then
yeah. And that's the Saudi-
others were wine is everything, except the Wahhabis were like no intoxicants or mind altering substances of any kind. So, which included video games. There's
People do get addicted to those.
they do.
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting to look at those. And I think that taverns are also really interesting, and eventually coffee houses. Because, and I'm an Ottomanist, as you could probably tell, but in the Ottoman Empire, I think this is just fascinating, because in a Jewish neighborhood, you would have Jewish taverns. In a Christian neighborhood, you would have Christian taverns, but you would always have Muslim patrons who would go to these. And typically they are lower middle class or below.
Okay.
So these are not fine establishments. There is very often prostitution associated with it, entertainment that is scandalous in other contexts, but it is allowed, right? Everybody knows that this
Interesting.
is there, and they don't stop Muslims at the door and say, oh, wait, no, remember, you can't have this stuff. So they existed. They were an important economic engine, especially in those neighborhoods.
bet.
They were an important community gathering place. They show up in stories all the time as being both a community place and a kind of scandal locally. And something else really important that just disappeared from my brain.
Classes?
Well, they were typically not a kind of middle class thing. Like if you could afford as a Muslim to drink privately at home, you would probably do that. And you would have friends come over, and it would be a private social thing, because of course there weren't restaurants. So people didn't go out and do that until coffee houses, which
Very good
were
point. Yeah.
more allowed than taverns, which were at the very bottom. Like if you were going to a tavern, that was definitely a mark on your reputation, right? But the other piece of this though is that over time, the janissaries and members of the Ottoman military, who, they weren't supposed to have any kind of hereditary wealth to pass on to children. They weren't supposed to have those divided loyalties. What ends up happening is, because they have urban power, they become their own kind of, I I don't want to say urban mafia, but they get kind of an economic lock on sectors of the economy, including coffee houses and taverns. So by the 18th and 19th centuries, maybe a little earlier, you have these functionaries of the Ottoman government, the military, who are involved in the illegal activity that the government is supposed to
Discourage.
limit and discourage, right? So they're bringing in all of that money, and so the trade in these things is obviously a lot easier when you can grease the wheels from the inside.
It's so true that about it being an economic engine. I mean, I don't know if it's true, but I have a friend who's she does urban marketing, like what kind of neighborhoods are prosperous, that kind of question. And I guess one of the best things to jumpstart a neighborhood economy is a brewery. Like, you know how we have all these microbreweries now? It's not a coincidence, like they're really just a successful way of, like a successful type of business,
Right.
you know? So, and because it
And
brings
I think it's
people-
because it brings people
Yes,
in and
yeah.
together, and it's both the brewery part and the bringing people in to drink and eat and all of that. So a little less risky than your typical restaurant. But yeah, and that's it's always been the case that there's money to be made, and when there's money to be made, people are going to want it and are going to want in on it. So I think if you look then into the modern era, right, where identity politics becomes much more controlled in some ways by the state and citizenship and what the laws of the state are for every citizen.
like this era now.
Right, exactly. So with that nation state consciousness, that's when you get things like total prohibitions of alcohol, like in the Islamic Revolution, right? Where our identity as Iranians is that we are Muslim, and Muslims don't allow anyone to drink wine, right? So you couldn't, under the Islamic Republic, even if you were a Christian or a Jew, you could not produce or sell alcohol, right? So in contravention of all the Islamic precedent before, because they were not doing the same thing. Although they were talking about the same Islamic traditions, they were actually doing something very different. That was about the state and control of all the citizenry rather than just Muslim communities, et cetera, right? Where the state and the Islamic
So
law
interesting.
piece come
Yeah,
together.
interesting distinction.
And then you have Turkey on the other side, right? Where you have a secular state ideology and where the state not only no longer prohibits or pretends to prohibit alcohol consumption, but in fact has a state distillery and
Oh,
for a
wow.
long time really bad wine, right? That the state produced cheaply in order to tax it, right? Because they had a monopoly on taxing it. And then eventually in Israel, in Lebanon, in Turkey first, and then later in Tunisia, you get the kind of revitalization of the wine industry as a component of the tourism economy, right? So building
That makes
upon
sense.
these historical traditions as national traditions and funneling more money or support to winemakers, looking for stories of traditional families who had maintained the tradition, et cetera. But you constantly have these things in tension, right? Private, public, religious identity and community and winemaking, and then things like the civil war in Syria and the rise of ISIS, and ISIS saying no, forget what the Syrian government said. Syrians don't do wine, and attacking the wineries. And so similarly in Lebanon, even though Christian communities for the most part are the ones who have maintained these winemaking traditions, there's a lot of enmity towards that by Muslims in Lebanon. But if it makes money, and tax revenue comes in. So there's always that tension, right? Like, to what extent do you want to crack down on things that are actually going to potentially bring in profit? And Israel, again, has revivified these ancient winemaking traditions, and then also brought in a lot of European winemaking traditions into the region. And now you have it in Jordan, in Iraq, in Syria. And it's this really interesting blend of these ancient traditions and what can we learn from modern winemaking and do it in more profitable ways, but still hanging on to enough of the tradition that you can use that as a marketing tool, right? So you have this, and
That's a
and
very
then you have,
cynical
yeah,
way of looking.
yeah, I'm pretty cynical. But you also have, monastic orders and communities who are still producing wine for their own ritual use and for the community's ritual use. And they're, in some cases doing it in relatively traditional ways, because they've been able to maintain those traditions over time, usually because they live really
Yeah.
far out of the way and,
That's where I wanna go.
pass under the radar. So I don't know anybody who's been on wine tours in the region and has experience with any of those, but
Let's
that's kind of what
organize
I
one.
see in Turkey.
Let's organize one.
Let's organize one. What a great idea. And like students in your classes can come for extra credit or what's the Maymester thing? Do you have something like that between?
Yeah,
I think that would be awesome.
something like that. We have all kinds of sessions, so, yeah.
Limited to students over 21.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe graduate students. I don't know. Faculty. That works. But yeah, any other thoughts, questions? I want more of all of your expertise. Yeah. I'd love to hear thoughts on climate change. And I know climate change is a huge issue for European winemakers.
Yes.
Not my area, but one of my good friends, Gabriella Petrick, is working on a long-term project on the impact of climate change on wine in Europe and Australasia and America and China. And it turns out a lot of this is deeply connected to flavor profile and taste, and that one of the things that she's been thinking a lot about is how do you culturally shift people's taste preferences for what they think of a good wine, because certain flavor profiles are,
Yeah.
because like you mentioned with certain grapes just can't give certain tastes, that
Right.
a lot of it has to be some culture of that.
Especially since it's an elite thing to do, like drinking wine's an elite thing to do. That's really interesting. Like, yeah, it's a fashion. There's probably fashions and flavors and stuff like that.
But then also the way that some of the things we don't often think about related to wine change wine, and she's done a lot of work on wildfire smoke and how it taints the grapes.
Yeah.
And then those grapes are just always gonna taste bad, no matter what your cultural taste preference is. There's just
Right,
this
right.
acridity and just, so how
It's a shame.
global
Yeah,
climate crisis is.
Yeah, I've heard about the smoke issue and what a problem it is for, I think it was in New York State when they, a few years ago when there were such high concentrations of particulates that they just couldn't do anything with the crop, right? So it's interesting. I mean, I'm cynical. I think that there are people who are, at the level of really understanding and appreciating particular tastes in wine who are going to, and who are